It's my pleasure and my honour to introduce my colleague and old friend, Dr. Victoria Clark, or Vicky as we call her. Vicky speaks globally, conferences, various events. She's a world-recognised authority on assessment. And in particular, I think what's interesting for us is that Vicky has worked on education reform programmes around the world, particularly in East Asia, but also in Europe, and no doubt in other places. So I'd just like to hand over to Vicky, who will be taking you through some very important questions about the role of assessment in EMI.
Policy, in fact.
Policy.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I apologise, I'm losing my voice, the words that my husband loves to hear. So I'll persevere on, everyone, okay? Today, what I'm going to be doing for the next 40-50 minutes is really a discussion work. I'm just going to quickly summarise a lot of the themes that we spoke about this morning, and then I want everyone to get up and we're going to talk to people and discuss some of the major challenges and how they relate to policy. So give me 10-15 minutes to summarise everything that's been said, hopefully, and a little bit more, possibly. And then we can actually get down to actually talking to each other about the challenges and how they relate to policy. So, very quickly, it has been made quite clear already the rationale for internationalisation of higher education institutions. But here are the objectives of my workshop. One is to actually mention them again. The other one is, and we've talked about this already, the definitions of EMI, and I'm going to go into a bit more detail about some of those issues. We're going to look at some other models of EMI that were already mentioned by our colleagues this morning. And then we want to really look at some of the challenges. Again, a lot of them have been focused on already, but I want us to go into depth about these challenges and list all the areas where the challenges exist. And then finally, we're going to come back together and just come to a consensus of how these challenges and how policy can actually impact them on a positive or negative way. What needs to be taken into consideration to ensure success at the EMI programme? So, I'll put them all up here so I don't have to keep clicking. We've all mentioned these. One of the main reasons for internationalisation and EMI, and again we'll go into the difficulties of that definition, is around the fact that English is the lingua franca. It is the world's preferred language, as we like to say. And clearly, due to globalisation, the move, the economy, people, services, etc., English is a means of communication around the world. It also allows higher education institutions to attract foreign students, as already mentioned, which is an income-generating, obviously, option, and to attract high-calibre faculty. The other area, the rationale, is around the reputation and status of the higher education institution by offering EMI. There are assumptions, and I'm going to use the word assumptions related to EMI and internationalisation, and one of those assumptions is it raises students' proficiency. Okay, and the other one, which we've talked about today, is it enhances students and also possibly lecturers' employability options. Okay, so we'll keep those in mind as we go along. And the definitions of EMI, we talked about the lack of consensus in the terminology already, and I'm going to use the same definition, just remind you, as was used this morning about internationalisation, EMI, being the use of English to teach subjects other than English in a country where the students do not have English as an L1. I'm going to go into deeper with the concept of use of English, because for me that's the problem. Okay, that's a clear definition. Now, is English a medium or the medium? Is English the only language being used, or is it only one of the languages being used? That's one of the issues. And also, which English? I think it was Andrew this morning mentioned, should it be British English, American English, Can it be World Englishes, Indian English, Singapore English? Can it be EFL, Chinese English, Uzbek English? What English is acceptable in terms of the materials, in terms of the teacher, in terms of whatever the medium is? And also, when we talk about English as a medium of instruction, is that English teacher's language? Is it the interaction between the teachers and the students? I think it was Andrew again mentioned how some students felt it strange to talk to other students in English. Yeah, it is, because that's not normal. We talk to each other in our first language quite clearly. So where is this English? Is it in the materials, the textbooks, the homework? Is it in the tests, exams? Some nations mandate certain exams that are in the L1, even for EMI institutions. So where is this English, and how much is it taught? And later on, I'll give you some quite shocking statistics about how much English is taught in some institutions. And here's the other question, which was touched upon. What is the relationship between content and language? Okay, and we're going to touch upon all these themes in our group discussion. To what extent are the content teachers responsible for the language of the students? In CLIL, we have an answer, almost. In EMI, we don't. We have, as we said, varying perspectives. And all of this we'll come back to in our group discussion. And finally, what are the objectives of EMI? Because if the objectives is to raise students' proficiency, perhaps we're not actually reaching those objectives. I think my colleagues again mentioned this morning, and we're going to mention again later, teaching in L2 leads to, often, less complex language, more teacher-centered teaching practices, lower order thinking, less critical thinking, slower and less deep, less precise content learning. So if we add all those elements, then what we're actually saying is that all the concepts of how we learn English are not being applied. Because to learn English, I need comprehensible input. I need pushed output. Okay, so people making me respond in English, giving me information at the right level or perhaps slightly higher in English for me to comprehend. I also need negotiation of meaning, where we can discuss, make sure we understand, clarify, ask questions. And I also need feedback. But if the research is saying that in L2 we have teacher-centered, less interaction, fewer pedagogical activities, then surely it's the opposite, isn't it? So one of those questions we'll come to in our discussion. Now let's have a look at some of the models. I'm going to take Macara's 5 models of how EMI has been implemented. And the first one is what they call the selection model. This one is the model used in China, where students actually have to pass domestic or international test first to allow them access onto the course. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't language support for the students, but it does mean the content teachers are confident enough to get on with the content and not worry about the language. Okay? I'm not saying that's a working model in China. I'm saying that's the model that China uses, that they have a test already. And we'll come back to the concept of elitism later with that model. Oops, I've turned it off. 1 second, technology. Okay, the second one is the Turkey model, the UAE model, Saudi model. This is a model where we recognize that after secondary school, English proficiency is not enough to handle an EMI course. So we have this 1-year bridge, okay, preparatory year, for them to improve their English, etc., academic skills. Again, it doesn't mean there isn't English later. In fact, there often is some English support later, but it allows that extra year to prepare students for the EMI. The third model here is one that's used in Hong Kong. I used to live in Hong Kong for many years, so it's a model I know well. Every secondary student has the right to go into EMI courses if they have the content knowledge, okay? If they pass the requirements for the content. Now, this model does support quite an interesting student support. It often includes more than EAP, ESP courses. It often includes language specialists where you can go and consult for reading, text, writing. So it does have quite a rigid and extensive language support mechanism. But as I said earlier, a shocking statistic. In a research report I read recently about EMI in Hong Kong, only 7% of the class was conducted in English, 27% through code switching, and the rest, you can mathematically do that, in Cantonese. Despite lecturers saying they taught 80% in English and students saying 50 to 60, 7%. Working with the Hong Kong government, they are worried that students now are entering university with an IELTS score and exiting with a lower IELTS score. That's an interesting move. Not perhaps the best way. Okay, then there's the multilingual model. Irrespective of the models that are being used, some of the content will be in L1. Now that could mean this lady's a content teacher. She teaches in L1. This lady's the language specialist, and she comes back with the class and helps them to understand, summarize in the L2. It could be that model. Or it could also mean programs where there's a lot of code switching. Okay, we mentioned the fact that lecturers often code switched to ensure the students understood the material. And finally, there's the ostrich model. The one where people stick their head in the sand, know there's problems, hope they'll go away if they ignore them. Okay, we're not advocating for that in the British Council, obviously. So, this is ready for your group work. There are 6 challenges here that we have in EMI, and I'm going to put you into 2 groups, and each group will focus on 3 of these challenges, okay? Now, the challenges we want to talk about in terms of policy are teachers and their proficiency. So, what are teachers' perspectives, attitudes towards EMI, especially when there's a top-down approach and they didn't want it? What is their proficiency level? How does that affect content and language learning? What happens if their proficiency is poor and students learn their errors? How does that work? Students and proficiency, what level, and the same with the teachers, what level, what test should we use? How should we gauge their proficiency? How should we see if their language is improving in a better way than if they only had English as a subject, not content through English? Because remember, one of the assumptions is that we improve English proficiency. Do we? We already mentioned some of the issues concerned with teachers. So how do we know if they're improving their proficiency? We can talk about some of those things. Reducing inequalities. In the China model, you can only enter EMI if you have a band 6, band 7, or the local test score of equivalency. So who has that English level in China? From what socio-economic background would you be in order to have that English level? So how do we reduce the fact that EMI can be elitist only for those with higher socio-economic status, parents with money that sent them to international schools or private English lessons. How do we reduce that? And if there are opportunities, and I think we all agree, enhanced opportunities for employability, how can we spread that to all? Additional support, what does that look like? EAP, ESP, how's that working? I go to many EAP, ESP departments around the world, and there's a clear disconnect between what's being taught and what the employers outside want from the students and what the content teachers in the university want from the students. So how's that working? What about additional support in terms of writing centres, the American sort of concept, or language specialists, language assistants, or co-teaching, content, language, co-constructing the curriculum? Which English? Is it okay to have Indian lecturers with Indian English? The British Council has just designed an English language test for Singapore with all listening in Singapore English, all reading texts, etc., ensuring it's Singapore English, because obviously that's a world English, it's a recognised English. Is that okay? Or do we still want the traditional British, preferably East London accent, or American accent? Is that what we want? What sort of English? And how is it used? Teacher to student, materials, slides, homework, tests. And finally, assumptions are improves students' English. Assumption number 2, it does no harm to your content learning. Already we've heard there might be some issues with that. If there's 22% slower, I think someone mentioned, Andrew mentioned, if teachers can't go too deep, can't be very precise, fall back on lower order thinking, basic questioning, fewer pedagogical activities, less interaction, are we doing no harm with the content? So cost and benefit analysis. Okay, so now I'll stop talking. I think I've summarised a lot of what's been already said. And what I want to do is I want this half of the room to stand up and go to that corner. This half, I mean, you can divide yourself roughly equally, I won't be counting, over to that corner. And I'll give you a worksheet and you can discuss with the person standing near you, or the person standing near you, some of these issues. And what we're trying to do, in 15, 20 minutes, we're going to discuss 3 aspects each. Group 1 will do teacher proficiency, reducing inequalities, and which English. Group number 2 will be students, additional support, and cost and benefit. And I want you to come up, you nominate at the end a speaker, and that speaker will come up with some of the issues that you've talked about with these challenges and how policy can affect it positively or negatively, or what needs to be done at a policy level to reduce the issues or improve the chances of success. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you can move to this stand up, and can you please introduce yourself to the person next to you? You know, talking to strangers is always weird, unless it's late at night at a bus stop, summer. But okay, if you can move over here. Sorry, group 1. Just 2 equal groups. And group 2, stand up. Let's get a bit of energy. Everyone's asleep after lunch. Just stand up, and I want you to move over, introduce yourself to the person standing next to you, and I'm going to hand out some handouts. Cherry, you're group 1. Sorry, Summer, can you give this to group 2? Your group 2, which is page 2. Your group 2, which is page 2. If you have a handout, thank you. Yeah, you have 15 minutes. So basically, I'm going to stop you at about 22. At 22, I'm going to stop you. You have your 3 areas to discuss. What I want is afterwards, I want you to discuss with the other group through microphone what areas, the areas you discussed, and the challenges you came to. So I'm going to nominate this lady to be the walk-arounder and gather all the information. I'm going to come back to you in 15 minutes. No pressure. Right, so the same over here. I'm going to nominate someone. Who can I see? Who's over here? Who's British Council? Is that Simon? No, but what the idea is, everyone talks to the person next to them, and this gentleman is going to walk around and gather your thoughts. You should have kept your mouth shut, sir. Something we often say to the British Council. Right, so basically, I want everyone to discuss with the person next to them, and you will go and gather some information. Okay, and I'll stop you in 15 minutes. I'll give you time to tell you. Okay, so off you go. You have 3 challenges. You're group 2. Perfect, right. They're talking. They go on as a summary, and someone can add before I look at some of the conclusions on how it would fit.
We would not what?
Yeah, is there any English that you would not want? No. Everything will be, as you said, intelligible. And okay, how's it going to go? First of all, our wonderful volunteers who didn't volunteer will quickly summarise their group's point. But once Maxime's finished summarising, I'm going to ask those from group 1 if they have anything to add. Because obviously Maxime couldn't have added everything that she heard, obviously. And then I'll move over to Tom. He'll give me a summary of group 2. And then I'll ask group 2 if anyone has anything to add. Okay? And then afterwards, I'm going to put up some ideas on the board, and we will have a look and see where the gaps were. Because I've put up some ideas, and we'll see what else has been discussed and how it relates to the policy. So, Maxime, can I start with you?
Okay, so teachers and proficiency, first of all, and apologise for all the points that I've missed, but I have written down here, first of all, a question of how to measure that proficiency. But also what proficiency we need to measure. So there's the point that was made that some of the teachers are very good in written English because they have publishing experience, but oracy, so speaking in the classroom, fluency, might be more of an issue. And then there was the point made that there are, in some cases, a shortage of subject specialists with both the written and the oracy skills to teach. Anything else? That there should be a strategy for CPD of the teachers. And then going on to which English. Again, assessment came up there in terms of which English for the sort of entry requirements. People mentioned TOEFL and IELTS, for example. And then there was a discussion about the role of the native speaker teacher, what native means there, whether it's a native English speaker or a native speaker of the local variety of English. And in some cases I heard interesting things being mentioned, can't remember the country, but you can chip in, English-speaking volunteers being used to overcome shortages in these areas. And then reducing inequalities. There were comments that I heard about inequality being natural or normal. There were comments that came out about the issue of inequality having been an issue in the past, but through work that's been done in the K-12 curricula, that it's changing. And I did actually see evidence of that myself in Turkey recently. And then an overall issue that I think came up was about the idea of a talent pipeline. So in all these things, teachers and proficiency, reducing inequalities, which English, we need to be planning about 15 years in advance in order to actually do something that's going to have an effect. Doing it once the teachers and the students are at the higher education level is too late. So I think that's...
Okay, let's go to group 2. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Look, it's more of a selection than a summary, because there were some amazing discussions happening and very good points made. One right at the top was that in terms of policy, ambition and top-down policy often outstrips the practical reality, particularly in trilingual contexts, and where there's a an ambition for plurilingualism. What's actually resulting is semilingualism, so people half knowing a language rather than actually being proficient in more than one. In terms of student perspectives, I think from everybody there was a recognition that students do believe in the employability benefits that will come from it, and students having that interest in developing their language as well. They were very positive factors. On the level of English, yes, B1 level is an absolute minimum, but is it B1 level in the right things? Are they able to do everything that's described in B1 across the CEFR, or do we want to have different profiles for different subjects? A nice point about, in an EMI context, what is the opportunity for practice of their language in their content areas. We know that in English as a subject, there's kind of this immediacy of application. You can use your language as a subject straight away, but if you're learning content in English, how soon will it be before you can actually use that in a practical domain? We have to do more in class than just traditional methods using textbooks if we're going to support student learning. But we also have to manage expectations of students in terms of whose responsibility it is and how much can be given to them and how much they have to adopt for themselves in terms of kind of learner training principles and making the most of the provision that's provided by the institution. People generally felt that ESP teachers in universities are a very important part of this process, supporting not only the students but also the EMI teachers. And people were making the point that without the basic general English communication skills, there's no academic specific purposes English that's worth focusing on. You can't have the CALP without the BICS, if you know Cummins' model. Teacher competence, crucial, and can we really expect content teachers to become language experts as well? What do they need in terms of language awareness to support students? I'll leave with a bigger picture one, which was maybe we need to start lower, and is it the education policy at public primary and secondary education that needs to be in place to support tertiary EMI?
Okay, thank you very much. And group two, is there anyone else who would like to comment? Or do you feel Tom has broached most of those points? Yes, that's a good summary, yes. Okay, thank you. Now, I've got one, thank you. Now, I'm going to just put a bit of controversy, and why not? And why not? Now, here's the slight problem I have with teacher and student proficiency. According to the CEFR, which we know to be the framework, describes language ability, B2 is the minimum language requirement because B1 is actually only around the familiar. That means that B1, and if you look at the CFR, you have A1, A2 is basic user, B1, B2 is independent user, C1, C2 proficient user, right? So the B1 is an independent user, but be very careful, everyone, because it means independent within the familiar. That means I can talk about my home, my family, my pets, my favorite restaurants, my job, my interests, at a very fluent level, if you wish. So I can tell you about my holiday I had recently in Vietnam, and I can tell you about the favorite restaurant I go to in Madrid, and everything about my family and what my brother does for a living and how horrible my nephew is. Everything. I can tell you all these things. But as soon as you then turn around and say, oh, Vietnam, how interesting. What's the architecture like in Vietnam? Then I can't answer. Because B1 doesn't go out of the familiar. We have to get into B2, where B2 is, and it makes it very clear, is where we can actually understand and produce language on a wide range of subjects outside the familiar. So in other words, I can talk about, for example, I can read an introductory text to philosophy. Okay, it's not my field. My field's obviously languages. Or I can pick up a magazine and talks about the features of the new iPhone. Or gentlemen, you can pick up any woman's magazine because women are always outside your familiar, okay? So we have all these things, but only at the B2. The other issue is we cannot explain complex concepts at B1. It's impossible. So go back to that architecture question, you're thinking, well, how am I going to answer that? Because I'm not an architect major. This is how a B1 would answer it. I don't know. This is how a B2 should answer it. Vietnam architecture? Well, I don't really know. I'm not really interested in architecture, but you know, the houses are a little bit sort of narrow, and they're quite, you know, there's only 2 or 3 stories, and there's sometimes like little that's a B2. I'm not thrown by the unfamiliar. So when we talk about levels of proficiency, then we do actually have to talk about B2. So what is the reality? We know our students are not B2. We know our professors are not B2. So what does that mean? And that probably shows what the research is saying, that they can't go very deep. They have to be very teacher-led, etc. But even if we do have the B2, here's the other issue. It's not just a matter of translating the content into another language. There are other pedagogical issues around teaching content through L2. So the professional development often focuses on language. It has to focus on effective pedagogical practices as well to ensure that there is sufficient interaction. Otherwise, the student's English doesn't improve. You can see the vicious circle going around here. There has to be pedagogical intervention or activities, so there's pushed output. So in other words, so tell me, summarize what I've just said, and then discuss with this gentleman what are the issues here. So there's negotiation of meaning, because that's how we learn language. It's not through osmosis, as we know. So we've got, in terms of policy, we have to be perhaps ambitious, but we also have to be realistic. Where's the support mechanism to get the students up to B2 and the professors at B2 minimum with effective teacher training? You mentioned Tom, you mentioned the secondary sector being, you know, often having to come up and work in parallel with the tertiary, because if tertiary is EMI but secondary sector isn't, then we have that mismatch. So policy has to reflect upon this, as well as government language and education policy, obviously, not just the EMI policy. We talked about, what else did we talk about? Expectations. Again, in this morning we talked about clear policy and guidelines. Who is responsible for the language side of EMI? ESP and content teachers often don't talk to each other. Now, I've worked in ESP departments in my life, and there's one thing I know is the students see ESP as a separate subject, not one that feeds into their content. They may do an essay with, you know, well-structured, good grammar, etc., punctuated, correct references, you know, in correct genre, and then I see their essay from another class, and they get a good grade, but they've employed none of those aspects into that essay. So there's a complete mismatch as well. So it's not just policy from a national level, even an institutional level. There has to be this meeting of the stakeholders together to actually co-construct the guidelines, make sure it's clear who's responsible for what are, content teachers are responsible for ensuring that what is being employed in outside support comes back into the class. Otherwise, they're working against us as ESP, EAP teachers. So, in summary, because we've only got a couple of minutes left, what we need to look at is, and I'm going to take it to the floor. Can you give me an idea on how a university's policy could improve some of those aspects? Can anyone give one idea of their context, if they work in a good EMI context, of what guidelines your university or higher education institution has given for you to work through some of those challenges? Anybody? In terms of teacher proficiency, let's start with teacher proficiency.
I can share experiences of Nazarbayev University, Astana, Kazakhstan, and I am from Graduate School of Education. And students, we teach master and PhD students, and along with our courses, we have EMI or EMI, English for academic purposes and English for professional purposes. So English for thesis writing also. And students, we work in collaboration. For example, when I supervise students' thesis writing, we do this in collaboration with our EAP instructors. So look here, we tell them, and even with the course, for example, when we teach, we tell them what are the aspects that we are writing, for example, literature review or methodology approach, or even paragraph writing, or the way how to provide argumentation and so on. And then they include this into their EAP course. So this close collaboration between EAP instructors, or ESP we can call within the ESP, and course instructors help students and provide them good support. I think this is one of the ways of helping them to do this.
Thank you very much. Exactly, that's certainly one of the guidelines. Okay, well, we'll jump, because we've got a few minutes. Student proficiency. Can anyone share with us either a good or bad example of their context to ensure that we have sufficient student proficiency?
Not necessarily a context, but an idea. Everyone's talking about student proficiency.
Yeah.
I think it's much more an issue of student mindset, because I've seen a lot of students who look at English as a subject they have to pass. They just have to get through that, get past that hurdle of that exam. Therefore, they don't transfer what they're doing in their English classrooms to their subject units. And I think now there's the opportunity with this whole employability agenda to actually get students to think about English as a life skill, as an employability skill, rather than just as a subject that they have to memorize, get through some exams and then forget about. And I think that would help with the dip in language proficiency that happens once they're going through their degree.
Absolutely.
So
and it also means that we have to move away from the grammar-based curriculum that unfortunately a lot of us are still entrenched in, because that is a subject as opposed to a skill, a lifelong full continuous learning. Reducing, yes.
Just comment for student proficiency. We teach, I'm from Ukraine, and we teach to foreign students in English, Ukrainian and Russian. And for those students who come to learn in Ukrainian or Russian, we have assumption that they need support and they have extra year, they have extra studies during curriculum on language, on Russian and Ukrainian. And for English students, there is general assumption that these people know English, and sometimes they know English better than faculty members, than teachers. That may be the case, but in reality, the spectrum of knowledge, of English knowledge among students is really high, from A1, A2, A2, okay, to native level. And this assumption is incorrect, and these people really need some kind of sorting in terms of levels and differentiating the support to them.
Absolutely. And could you turn behind you? The gentleman behind you, which is thank you very much.
Yeah, just really quickly.
About the differentiation.
Yeah, I think one of the things about finding ways to address those differences and levels of proficiency in the classroom is introducing more multimodal aspects in the classroom and looking at issues of things like context literacy. So, rather than having classes where it's the usual lecture, student listening, maybe discussions, participation in tasks, actually doing more debates and having more opportunities for people to prepare and participate in different ways in different types of activities.
Okay, and that one last comment over here. Absolutely, but again, that goes back obviously to teachers' proficiency and ability for pedagogical activities, do group work and interaction.
Thank you.
And the last comment from this lady.
As a EMI university from Azerbaijan, Khazar University, we do following for students to get their proficiency level. We do teach 4 semesters of English. And the first year is a foundation, they get foundations, and then EAP and ESP on the second year. And we usually prefer to have content teachers to teach ESP so that they can, get into the depths of content knowledge.
Okay, interesting model. Thank you very much. And I think very last one, so
well,
to the ladies.
I guess Group A1 does also well, so therefore we have to shift attention to this part of the world. Well, I think that, there's a growing disappointment. The fact is that there is an education requirement inflation right now. That means the universities abroad are willing to have more international students, and therefore the requirements go down. And once they do their studies, and what the conventional wisdom over there is that they write the essays, outsource their pieces, and oftentimes the professors are not taking it seriously, And once they have degree from leading universities, and when they enter the labor market, the quality is not what we expect. Number two is that sometimes students go to different universities with an expectation that they will get classes in English, but oftentimes they have a mishmash, so basically, well, as you said, partly Chinese or let's say German and so forth, and therefore the impact is not what we projected, and therefore they envisage that, well, they have a degree, a diploma, but they are not necessarily competent, and in the competitive labor market, they cannot withstand the whole pressure. And therefore, now the fact is that you have a degree from a university abroad does not necessarily imply that you are good at in your field.
Absolutely. Okay, a lot to think about, so we can't get through everything. But to summarize and just to close, then clearly these are just some considerations when we come to policy and guidelines. And clearly, as we've said, there are multiple issues and they're all very much interlinked as well. So thank you very much for your discussion and your interest. And I think we're finishing now. Thank you very much. Thank you.